Righty. So, originally tonight's class was going to be on the family nature of the Lord's church. Ran out of time on preparing that, and so fell back on another topic that I planned on dealing with in this series anyhow. And so we're going to talk about love tonight, specifically the command to love one another. The word love appears a lot in the Bible. Hmm? Yeah, something's coming. So, but the word love, it's in the Bible a lot, 325 plus times, almost 200 of those found in the New Testament. And so as we're studying in the New Testament, love, is discussed a whole bunch. Matthew 22, verse 36, Jesus was asked by one of the Jewish leaders, what is the greatest commandment of all? And in answer, he quoted Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your mind. And then he not only identified that as the greatest, but then he gave a bonus answer. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so love is just a primary focus of the New Testament and the New Testament writings. In fact, Jesus tells us that we need to love our enemies, Matthew 5 and at verse 44. A lot easier to say that than it is to do that, but Jesus says that we need to have that kind of love and that kind of imitation of him, that we would love our enemies. And so we're not going to talk about the love of enemies tonight. We're not going to talk about the love of God tonight, or love of others. Our focus is on love one another, not loving those who are outside of the faith, but specifically in the faith. But hopefully, what we understand as we're studying all of that is that every aspect that God has called us to demonstrate love, and we need to do so. But in a series that's dealing with the church and images concerning the Lord's church, this, I think, is one of those where we are commanded to have a great love for each other. And so that's going to be the focus of our study tonight, is the need for us to love one another. In fact, the phrase love one another appears 12 times in the New Testament. And so it is mentioned a number of times. Worth noting, perhaps, that 75% of those are in the writing of John. John focuses a lot on the need for God's people to have love. It's one of those major themes that show up in his writing. So, on the screen, I've got a question: what is love? We've got one English word, which is used for different scenarios. Whether it be family love or romance or all kinds of things, passionate love, parental love, brotherly love, just kinship between people who are in the same vocation. The one word describes all of those. Anyone know how many different Greek words there are for love?
Oh, there's more than one.
More than one, yeah. I have come across at least 8. So, we have one word in English that captures at least 8 Greek words. And we're not going to look at all of the Greek words. We'll look at a few of them just very, very briefly. This is storge, which is a natural love that exists within the family unit, and so parent toward child. This is eros, which is romantic or erotic love, often rooted in physical contact. This is ludus. Ludus is a playful or flirtatious love, typical of what we would call infatuation. Pragma is a bond of affection or codependence that develops over time. Our word pragmatic comes from this Greek word. This is philo. Philo is love between friends. It's commonly identified as brotherly love. The city of Philadelphia, Philo is part of that phrase. And then this one is agape. That's the one we're going to be focused on. Now, I don't have 8 on there. I've got 6. The others I just didn't include in the series. Just say them? Say them. Okay. So the first one is storge, then eros, ludus, pragma, philo, and agape. So, yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah, agape is the most common love. So when we read about God loving us, I believe it is always agape. I think that is the case. I'm trying to think of a time when it's not agape, and I can't think of one. And so that's, I believe, commonly the case. When Jesus says that we are to love our enemies, that's agape that he's using. He's not saying we should have a family type love for our enemies or pragmatic love towards our enemies or anything of that nature. It is agape. Agape is defined as a selfless love. It is a love that gives without expectation of reciprocation. And so I've used the phrase a dispassionate love. And so a lot of these are based upon feelings that we have. Agape is not based in feelings. That doesn't mean that there won't be feelings involved, but the root catalyst of agape is not I feel. The catalyst for agape is it is right to do what is right, and therefore I will do what is right, and I will demonstrate love. It's an active love. It's not just it's not emotional at all. And so our focus is going to be on this agape love that the Lord wants us to have. And when you see these verses that say love one another, all of those are agape love. He's wanting us to have an active, dispassionate love for one another. One writer at Christianity.com gave the following description for agape. Agape love is unconcerned with the self and concerned with the greatest good for another. Agape isn't born just out of emotions, feelings, familiarity, or attraction, but from the will and as a choice. Agape requires faithfulness, commitment, and sacrifice without expecting anything in return. That is a good definition of what agape love is. And as we said, it's the love that's used to describe God. In fact, 1 John 4, verse 8, and again at verse 16, John writes, God is love. God is agape, is what John wrote there. And so God is this kind of love, and he wants us to be imitators of him and show that kind of love. John 3:16, for God so loved the world, agape is the love that's talked about there. All right, so let's turn our attention to the phrase love one another. And again, it appears 12 times. We're not going to look at all 12 times that it appears, but we will look at a handful of them. Some of them certainly out of the writings of John. So John chapter 13, in John 13 through 17, what we have is a record of the night in which Jesus was betrayed. Starts with Jesus and the apostles. They're in the upper room. They're sharing the Passover together. And Judas ends up being identified as the betrayer. And he goes out and he does what he needs to do in order to identify Jesus to the people that are coming with him. You know, just a very emotional night. And so in the midst of that night, Jesus had a lot of important things to teach his disciples. Among the things he taught them, you'll remember at the beginning of chapter 13, when they all came into the upper room, who washed their feet? At first, nobody, right? Because, well, this is a rented room, so their ego was raised. Right. I'm not the host. It's not my house. And, you know, because that was typical of Jewish custom, is that you go into someone's home and they would wash your feet, or at the very least provide the implements for you to wash your own feet. Well, none of them got down and washed anybody's feet because I'm not the host of this event. Who's the host of the event? Jesus is the host of the event. Can you imagine just sitting around thinking, Well, I'm not going to do it. It's not me. And the thought doesn't even cross your mind that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is the host of the event that you're at. And maybe we don't want him washing people's feet. But what does he do? Takes the outer garment off, girds himself with a towel, and goes around and starts washing their feet, right? And what he wanted them to learn from this is service. You need to be willing to serve one another. And in order to do so, you need to be willing to humble yourself. And so Jesus humbled himself and went about and washed their feet. Remember when he gets to Peter, Lord, are you washing my feet? You will never wash my feet. And then, Peter, if you want any part of me, then this is going to happen, right? So, yeah, wash all of me, Lord, right? And so that was one of the great lessons for them to learn. And that lesson, he then builds upon it when he gets down to verse 34. Because when he says, you shall love one another. Now, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. Jesus loved them enough that he washed their feet that night. None of them stood up and did that, right? And so that is certainly comes into play here, but it's even greater than that because he's going to do something even bigger later on that night. He's going to give himself for them entirely, giving his life eventually the next day. So a new commandment, let's start with that. A new commandment I give to you. Has there never been a commandment to love one another in Scripture? Is this the first time that God ever said, love each other? No, this isn't it, right? You go back to Leviticus 19. Now, remember, at the beginning, I said a Pharisee came to Jesus, or a scribe came to Jesus and asked him, what's the greatest of all the commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, right? That's the greatest. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. That's Leviticus chapter 19 and at verse 18. And so the command was already there to love one another. It's not a new commandment. So how can Jesus then here say, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another?
Was that a question?
That's a question.
No.
Okay, that comes into play here. The answer is in the next 5 words. As I have loved you. So Jesus has just elevated the degree of love. You know, the old covenant, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Do good to your neighbor. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That would be a rewording of that command, right? Jesus says, I want you to love one another as I have loved you. And so he already exemplified that by humbling himself and washing their feet. But it's not going to stop there because later on he's going to give his life for them. That's a lot more, right? And so a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, as Jesus has loved us, that we also ought to love one another. And so we need to love each other sufficiently that we're going to be serving each other and praying for each other. And if there's conflict, we're going to be willing to forgive one another. We're going to bear with one another. We talked about that in a lesson not too long ago, that some of those times that we read the words bear with one another in love, it's put up with each other. We want to comfort each other and be kind and be an encouragement, and at times need to admonish one another, but do all those things in love. And so Jesus wants us to understand he's the example of that. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. Now, a couple chapters later, he comes back. It's the same discourse. He hadn't, it's same discussion going on. And he comes back to the idea of loving one another. So chapter 15, verse 12, beginning, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. Verse 17, these things I command you, that you love one another. So Jesus is building on where he had been at the beginning of that night, and like, guys, you need to be willing to die for each other. Go ahead.
It seems to me agape is quite separate from all the other three words that come from love.
Oh, yes.
There's a very fine line there. Agape seems to be a lot of times, I think the other Greek words of love, a lot of that includes the happiness involved.
Yep.
It's us taking action and of course we happy with it, but agape doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be happy in every situation.
Right.
This is a much different kind of love.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this love is above any other.
Yeah. This is the greatest love.
Yeah. If it is the right thing to do, then we do it.
Yeah.
That's this kind of love. And then again, Jesus has absolutely elevated the degree of love in this text. So not only be willing to wash one another's feet. Remember, at the beginning of that evening, they're not willing to do that, right? I'm not washing their feet. I'm not the host. And then Jesus does it. How do you think all of them felt when Jesus got up and got the towel and got the bowl of water?
Yeah. I'm going to be giving my life free.
Right.
And here we are. The argument over some water.
Yeah.
Me. Oh boy, you guys got some things to learn.
Yeah. Boys, we got a simple lesson for you to learn before we get to the big stuff, right?
Yeah.
But imagine how they feel when Jesus is the one who's now washing their feet. Like, this isn't what we wanted. You know, none of them would have desired for that to be the outcome. And they all must have felt really bad about this. Like, oh, I really wish I'd got up and washed feet, right? But you can't do it after somebody's already done it. And so they needed to show love first. Yeah.
And that's what Jesus was doing there too. He would show them love by doing all that. Like he's teaching them.
Yeah.
I think he got the lesson across the table that night, and that they think they learned.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, you know, why didn't Jesus do this at the start of the supper? Because he got up after supper and did this. He gave them all the opportunity for someone to step up and someone to show love for each other. And no one would do it. And how many times did his disciples, as they were walking along behind Jesus, argue about who's the greatest among them, right? And on this evening, after it's pointed out that there is a betrayer in their midst, you know, is it I? Is it I? Is it I? And then eventually the is it I turned into, well, of course it's not me, right? They started defending themselves and exalting themselves, and you know, that none of them would do it, right? They too often were arrogant about themselves. And you know, how often are we arrogant, right? And so they needed this humbling and needed to learn, guys, you got to be servants. You got to love each other and you know, be willing to wash feet. If they're not willing to wash each other's feet, are they going to be willing to die for each other? Right? Because that's where he ends up in the lesson is you need to be willing to die for each other. But at the beginning of this night, they wouldn't even wash feet. Go ahead.
Arrogance is such a hindrance to love. It gets in the way so much. And I think this is what God was telling me that almost 2,000 years ago, here we are studying this. We've learned this. Right? I've been a Christian for a few years. We've been learning this stuff. And his hope was that we would learn this kind of story. So in any situation, he would expect as any of his children, the God's elect, that we would stand up and we would be the first one to say, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Not, hey, you can let me do that. God wants us to serve. We're not here to be served. As Jesus came here to serve.
Yes. Yeah. And it requires us getting rid of the me. It has to be, we get focused on other people.
Yeah.
So, verse 13, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. The stakes are much higher than washing feet, right? But that's what he wanted them to understand is, guys, we need to have this kind of love for each other. If we're unwilling to do simple acts of love, then how could we ever aspire to display the kind of love that Jesus wants us to have? And that is that we're willing to die for one another. And here's the thing, Jesus was not dealing with hypotheticals. He's not just presenting a scenario and saying, hey, you know, it'd be great if you're willing to lay down your life for your friends. Never going to happen, boys, but it'd be great if you No, because what's going to happen right after this, right? They get up and they walk out and they go over into the garden, and Judas leads a troop of individuals who are coming and they are wanting to arrest Jesus. And that night, Jesus demonstrated this love for them. John chapter 18 and at verse 4 and again at verse 7. When this group has come with Judas, Jesus asked, "Whom are you seeking? Who are you here for?" And, of course they came for Jesus, but it sounds as though they may have had in mind to just go ahead and arrest the whole lot of them. Let's just take the disciples as well. And so in John 18 at verse 8 and verse 9, it says, "Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave to be with me, I have lost none." Jesus just put himself out there for them. All of them were likely to be arrested. And twice Jesus says, "Who are you here for? You're here for me, right? Then let them go. You don't need to arrest them. Just let them go." And so he told them this, and then 3 chapters later, the ball is rolling for him to now show it, that this is a reality. And then the next day, he would offer himself in the fullest extent, giving his life. And so again, love one another as I have loved you was the command that he gave. And again, it wasn't just a hypothetical. It's a reality. And this is the kind of love he wants us to have. All right, John 3:16. Anybody?
Sunday, remember, we did until the first night of wrestling.
Good. 1 John 3:16. Anybody? It's similar. So we'll start at verse 11. "This is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, as not as Cain, who was of the wicked one. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren. He who does not love his brother abides in death." Then verse 16, "By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." It sounds like John got the point. When Jesus was teaching this stuff back in John 13 and John 15 and then putting it into practice in John 18, John saw it. Okay, I understand what he's saying. He wants us to be willing to give ourselves. And so love one another, not like Cain. Cain didn't love his brother. Cain hated his brother, and therefore he destroyed his brother. But if we want to pass from death to life, he's talking spiritual here, then we need to love the brethren. If we don't love our brother, we abide in death. We don't have spiritual life in us. What does it mean then to love my brother? Well, he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Wow. Now, in the context of this, John has talked about it. Well, let's actually just turn to it. Go ahead and turn to 1 John chapter 3. And let's see. In the verse, okay, so 16. Look at 17. "But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth." Do you see what he just did there? So, verse 16, here is the commandment. This is what Jesus said. If we're going back to John 13 and verse 34, and we were to bring it forward, and John is quoting basically what Jesus said. We need to have this kind of love that we're willing to lay down our lives for the brethren. Verse 17. Now remember where Jesus started, right? Guys, which one of you is going to be willing to get up and wash other people's feet? And they all failed. Not one of them got up and washed feet. Verse 17, whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? And so John steps back and he says, let's try something simple. You've got a brother who has need, and you have the ability to minister to that, and you don't want to. And so you don't. How likely are we then to die for that brother if we weren't willing to minister to that brother's needs, right? John did the same thing here that Jesus did back in John chapter 13, except it's in reverse. He gives, here's what we're called to do, and he shows them something that's underneath and says, folks, we're not even doing this. We're not even doing this. How are we going to get up here? How are we going to do this? And so verse 18, let us love, not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. He's not saying don't say you love each other. By all means, we ought to say we love each other. But if all we do is say we love each other, we don't show love, it's not love at that point. Because agape, which is the love he's talking about here, agape is an active, dispassionate love that does good because it is right to do good. That is this love. And so it is incumbent upon us then to show it. Romans 5 verse 8 is another one of the times that this word agape appears, and it's about God's love towards us. God demonstrated his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Right, yeah. Can you imagine if God said, hey, everybody, I love you. Take care now. Where would we be? Still dead in sin, right? God demonstrated his love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Active love. He did something. He demonstrated his love. And so the verse 17 and back to verse 16 in our text here, 1 John chapter 3, he's asking for demonstration of love. It's not enough just simply to say, yeah, I love you. That's good. It's good to say we love each other, but we need to demonstrate it. We need to do the work that shows that we love each other, do the good that demonstrates that we love each other. And so John understood the application of Jesus' words back in John chapter 13, and therefore he emphasizes here in this text. So, verse 23, still in John 13, down to verse 23. And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandments. This is John directly referencing John 13:34. He gave us that commandment. I was there when I heard him say it. And he calls upon us to love one another, even as he gave the commandment for us to love one another. In fact, twice more, John is going to emphasize the need for us to love one another in 1 John and then again in 2 John. Look at chapter 4 and at verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Sometimes that verse is portrayed as this, fluffy, fuzzy type thing, right? That is not what that verse is. How did God love us? Jesus died. That's how God loved us, right? Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And how did God show love? God died for us. And so how do we show love? The willingness that we would even die for one another. He who does not love, verse 8, does not know God, for God is love. And in this, the love of God was manifested toward us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him. And this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and his Son sent his son to be a propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
In the beginning, we don't know so long. We just know he's been around since the beginning. But he always loved us, even before the creation.
Yes.
I think
Oh, yes. Yeah. The plan for Jesus to die was from before the foundation of the world. So before creation. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And so, there's the perfection of God's love, right? He's already prepared for us doing things that are contrary to his will and demonstrating love to us in that state. When he loved us, we were enemies of God because we had chosen our way instead of God's way. Right. Now, go back to love your enemies, right? Because Jesus told us to love our enemies. You've likely heard me say a number of times, and hopefully you never get tired of it because it is absolutely true. God never commands us to do anything that he himself is not willing to do or has not done for us. Love your enemies as yourself. Love your enemies, right? Jesus loved his enemies. He died for us when we were still his enemies. And so when he asks us to love our enemies, it doesn't sound real good. It doesn't sound like an easy thing, and it's not an easy thing, but he demonstrated it because we were enemies because of our sin. When he died for us, he loved us. All right. 2 John. So turn the page. Let's go on over to 2 John for a moment. Chapter 1. There's only one chapter there. Verse 5. 2 John and verse 5. And now I plead with you, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment to you, but that which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, that as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. Now, he mentions lady in the text. He's likely using that to talk about the church. The church is the bride of Christ. He's not writing to one particular woman, if I understand correctly. Back in verse 1, the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all those who have known the truth. He's using this lady image to refer to the church, which is the bride of Christ. And of course, the Christians are the children that are talked about in the text. And so he says that we need to keep this commandment. It's not as though I wrote a new commandment to you. Jesus gave the commandment. He's the one that made it new, and it's been repeated over and over. And so we've had this commandment from the beginning of the gospel that we need to love one another. And he doesn't even at this point feel the need to go into any kind of long description on how that plays out, right? It's already been dealt with on other occasions, the need for us to love one another, that we're willing to die for one another. And so he just leaves it at that we've heard it from the beginning. You should walk in that commandment. Have that kind of love towards one another. I love the fact that John is so focused on love. Do you remember when Jesus and the apostles were headed towards Jerusalem on one occasion? And they stopped at a Samaritan village, and the Samaritans did not want Jesus to stay there, right? And so a pair of Jesus' disciples said, Lord, do you want us to call fire from heaven as Elijah did? Do you know who those two were? The sons of thunder, James and John. John, who at one point said, Lord, do you want us to burn up this Samaritan village for you, is now saying, no. We need to love one another so much that we're willing to die for each other. How many Samaritan villages do you think this John is willing to burn up? He wants to go teach them the love of God, right? John is a very different man at this point. Early on, it was immature John who was just on fire, and I appreciate the on fire thing, and we need to rein that in and get control of it so that we're actually using it in a productive way, right? And all of us have been there at one time or another, and we need to grow and we need to mature, and we see John's maturity, and God needs to see us maturing as well.
Yeah, if you're not cleaning anybody's feet right now, start working on that.
Right. And the whole cleaning thing or washing feet, it's an illustration, right? There's some churches where they actually have a ceremony about washing feet, right? That won't do us any good. Anyone here come without footwear tonight? Everybody had footwear.
Except for Abel.
Oh, well, Abel did. Okay, so if you got
We carried him.
right, okay, he got carried in. So, all right, so think about it. In the first century, even if they had footwear, it wasn't like our footwear, right? It was basically a slab with a rope over the top that held it onto your foot, right? And you're walking along, and what are you walking on? Dirt. Yeah, so dirt roads with basically flip-flops. What's going to happen to your feet?
Dirty.
They're getting dirty. Everywhere you go, they get dirty, right? And so you get into somebody's home and let me wash your feet for you, right? Because your feet are dirty. If we come in and we've been wearing modern day shoes and walking on pavement, how dirty are our feet? Right. And so we don't need our feet to be washed. And so his point is not set up foot washing ceremonies. His point is serve each other. Find the opportunities to serve in whatever way that we're able to serve and do it. Show love for one another by servants. And so it's no foot washing ceremonies, but a whole lot of foot washing, hopefully in that figurative sense of let's find good to do in order to serve one another. Agape love, absolutely. All right, Romans chapter 13 and verse 8. Romans 13 and verse 8. So, in this context, the apostle starts by talking about our responsibility to government. He bluntly states, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. And as he continues his thought, the topic of taxes comes up, render to all their due, taxes to whom taxes, and customs to whom customs, and fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. And then he gets to verse 8. And he says, owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. What a great perspective on love. He just said love is a debt. Love is a debt that we owe and that we need to pay. And we can't pay tomorrow's love debt today. We can pay today's love debt today, and we ought to. But then tomorrow, when tomorrow comes, well, I already paid the love debt, right? Well, it comes new every day, right? There's a need for new payment every day. And the opportunities are going to be different day by day. And who we show love to is going to be different day by day. Who we have the opportunity to serve will be different. But every day is an opportunity. Charles Hodge, in his commentary on Romans, stated, acquit yourselves of all obligations except love, which is a debt that must remain ever due. You can't pay it off. It's a debt that just over and over keeps showing up. And that's okay.
No, it's given to us.
Right. Yeah, every day that's given to us comes with new responsibility. Well, I lived yesterday. Can I just opt out on today? No. We have obligations every day, and love is one of those. And so it's that ongoing debt that we can never love enough on one day that okay, I'm good for the next couple of weeks, right? Every day is an opportunity. Now, our ability to serve might be different from day to day, right? And so we need to acknowledge that. But our willingness to love and to demonstrate love needs to always be there. God never expects us to do beyond our ability, but if we are able and we have opportunity, then he wants us to love.
Sitting. That conversation.
Yeah.
he figured we can't live our lives without sinning.
Right.
And you would question him that third day that you never sinned. He said yes. I said, well, what's wrong the next day? Would you gonna sin that day?
Absolutely.
Same thing, right? We can live a life of no sin and serve every single day.
Yes. Yeah. They're sort of opposite sides of the same
Of
coin.
course they are.
So yeah, absolutely. So every day is a new opportunity to serve God and not self, and to serve others and thus demonstrate love. And so to stay away from sin and to be obedient to God. Every day is fresh for us to do that.
They that perishes, but food that endures of the everlasting life.
There we go. Absolutely. Now, haven't got this one to put it up on the screen, but Galatians chapter 5 and at verse 13. So Galatians 5, in the context, some are focused on their freedoms. I got liberty, I got my freedoms. Galatians 5, verse 13, you, brethren, have been called to liberty, only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. You are not free from the debt to serve one another and the debt to love. That, again, is a new debt every day that we have. And so we need to be ever willing to put others ahead of ourselves and to set aside our freedoms in order to serve others. Now, there are times when we're not going to be able, we won't have the ability to minister to people in this capacity or that capacity. But the Lord wants us to have the willingness, if we are able to, and maybe we're not able to, but we can put someone in touch with somebody else who is able to, right? And so don't have the idea that, oh, well, I'm free in Christ, therefore I'm free of the obligation to love. No, we're free from the debt of sin, but we still have the obligation to love. That is the commandment that Jesus has given us. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love. So don't lose our patience with each other. And that can be challenging at times. But we need to be patient, and we need to seek to encourage and to build up. And so be gentle, be lowly, be long-suffering. That phrase, bearing with one another, in that text, I can't remember what translation it is. It's not one that I would suggest you go and buy and use as your daily Bible. But there is a translation that renders it as putting up with one another. And my understanding of the word that's used there, that is the correct idea. Put up with each other. Are there things about me that might be annoying? Don't answer, please. Don't answer. There likely are, right? But if it's not sinful, then just put up with it, right? And the same goes the other direction. And that's what we do in families, right? We put up with each other in families, and we love each other in families. And so the Lord calls upon us to do the same.
Is Paul trying to tell, through all these letters, of course, he's teaching, he's edifying each one of these Christians that this is how the church is supposed to look. This is what the church is supposed to look like. This is how the church is supposed to be carrying itself and being exemplified itself. And then it gets carried out to the world by us.
Yes.
Being the light of the world amongst the first generation.
Yes. Yes. And in back up to John. Go to John 17. In John 17, we've got Jesus' prayer, and often Matthew 6, verse 9 and following is called the Lord's Prayer. This, to me, is the Lord's Prayer. The other one is the Lord's Prayer as well, right? But this one, the other one was an example of here's how you pray, right? This one, do you know that he prays for us? We're in his prayer in John 17, right? So listen to what he says. Let's pick up at verse 20. So in verse 20, I do not pray for these alone, talking about the apostles, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. That's us, right? We're those who would believe in Jesus through their word, that they all may be one, as I, Father, are in you, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. And the glory which you gave me, I have given them, that they may be one, just as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you gave me, may be where I am, that they may behold my glory with which you have given me, for you loved me before the foundation of the world. All right, so he wants us to be imitators of him, to have that unity that he and the Father have, and part of that is going to be us displaying the kind of love that he has shown, right? And the end result is that the world may believe that you sent me. Right. So when you and I walk in the footsteps of Jesus and love like Jesus loved, that is evidence to the world that God has sent Jesus into the world. When we don't walk that way, that's evidence to the world that they're really not his disciples. It's not evidence that God didn't send Jesus in the world. He did. But when you and I don't walk as we ought to, then we give the Gentiles reason to blaspheme the name of God, to borrow from the Old Testament. And so we need to have the kind of love that we're called to have, and that will affect people around us in the world, and they will be prompted, hopefully, in that to come to the Lord. All right, couple more verses and the lesson is yours. But concerning brotherly love, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 9, concerning brotherly love, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. I love the way he words this. Concerning brotherly love, you have no need that I should write to you. Do you know how long these people were Christians? The church at Thessalonica. Very short time. Paul shows up, preaches on the first Sabbath, preaches on the second Sabbath, preaches on the third Sabbath, and gets forced out of town because there's a Jewish mob that is chasing him away, right? And so he goes from there and goes on to Berea and so forth. So these are Christians who had an apostle with them for just 3 weeks, and then off he goes. And he's writing back to them very soon afterward. I don't know the exact time frame, but I suspect within the year, he is writing back to them to check up on them, to see how they're doing. And he's heard some reports here and there about them. And what he says to them is, about brotherly love, you have no need that I write to you. I hear about your brotherly love. I hear about your faith. I hear how well you're doing in all these things. But then he grounds it in this. You have been taught by God to love one another. Well, how were they taught by God to love one another? Jesus died for them. Jesus is the example. And so just as he loved us and was willing to die for us, we also ought to love the brethren and be willing to give our lives to the brethren. 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, right? And so they understood it. They got it. These were young Christians, and they got it. And so we need to get it. We need to understand the need for us to love each other and to walk in love day by day towards one another. One more text. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22. Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. So obedience to God's word is the basis for which we have become partakers of the salvation and the sanctification that God supplies. And so we purified our souls through the obeying of the truth, through the Spirit, and then he immediately adds in there, in sincere love of the brethren. You see, it's not just me and God. That's not the nature of the relationship. Yes, he died for me so that I could be his child, but I'm not a child by myself. I'm not the only child of God, right? I'm a child among many children of God. And so it's not just about me, it's about the brethren. And so you purified your souls in obeying the truth, and God has saved you so that you can have sincere love for God's people. Because you've been added to a body of believers, you've been added to a family, and therefore love one another fervently. He doesn't say love one another lackadaisically, love one another lazily. Love one another when it's convenient. Love one another just a little bit, right? Love one another fervently. There's diligence in this. Love one another fervently with a pure heart so that we are imitators of God. That's what Peter's calling us to do. Guess who is also sitting there at the table when Jesus demonstrated love and then when Jesus later on commanded love? This guy was. Peter heard the same commandment that John heard. And so he words it differently when he writes it, but it's the exact same thing. Friends, we need to love each other. We need to love each other with fervent hearts and have sincere love and commitment towards one another. Okay. Anything else on love one another? There's a whole lot more that we could look at, but our time is gone, and we're at the end of my notes too. So this is what God wants us to be, right? 1 Corinthians 13, if we have not love, we have nothing. You know, that's his whole point in 1 Corinthians 13, is that we need love. And that doesn't negate the need for obedience. That doesn't set aside the importance of God's word and the necessity of believing the truth and walking in truth. But though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I've become a sounding brass and a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gifts of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. That whole give yourself and for somebody else, even if we did that, but love is not the motive. He says, so what? Love needs to be the motive. It has to come from agape love. And he's going to continue on in this chapter to talk about love. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. That's powerful. Verse 13. This is likely the quickest lesson on 1 Corinthians 13 ever, right? Verse 13, though. And now abide faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Do you see how much God exalts love? That's why John writes, God is love, right? Love is the greatest of all things. Now, faith, hope, and love, those are really good things, right? Why is love the greatest of those?
Because it's lasting.
Yes.
Unlike faith and hope.
Right. Yeah. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. But if you finally see it, you don't have faith anymore, right? Because then you've realized your faith. Hope is the expectation of something that you do not have. But when you finally have it, you no longer hope for it. And so we have faith and hope in the here and now. And when we pass on from this world, then faith is no more, because we are in the spirit realm, we'll be among God's people, and we'll see God as he is. And when we're in heaven, there's no more hope of heaven, because, well, we haven't. But what endures forever is love, because God is love. All right, love one another. Hopefully that is beneficial for us this evening.